Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for making time for our case study. My name is Zach Chandler, and I'm with the Center for Open and Reproducible Science at Stanford. And I'm joined by my two colleagues, Sangeetha Chowhan and Ian Mathews. So today we're talking about open science, data management, and research security. And our case study has to deal with how we used ORCID in an application. So ORCID is well known as the persistent identifier of choice by researchers to create a unique and persistent profile of their work. Persistent identifiers are a core part of the open science landscape and increasingly required by federal agencies. NSPM 33 specifically mentions that persistent identifiers must support, quote, secure integration with standard authentication services, such as SAML and OAuth. And so this here is a data management case study from Stanford University showing how we did exactly that. First, we're going to walk you through the Stanford ORCID Gateway, an app we built in partnership. It was a multidisciplinary team from University IT and Stanford Libraries with help of the School of Medicine. It's an app that we built that pairs ORCID ID with our local Stanford Unique ID through an OAuth workflow. Individuals log into the gateway. They're routed to ORCID to claim their ORCID ID, which is then returned to us along with a persistent token that allows us to update users' ORCID records on their behalf. In the past, we've given various presentations about this and how it interoperates with our profiles and library systems for publications. Today, we're focused on the security and data management affordances using institutional assertions, SAML, which is the security assertion markup language standard that many of you are familiar with anytime you log into a third-party app that's integrated with your single sign-on from your university or institution. It's probably using SAML. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sangeetha Chowhan, who is responsible for leading the build team. And she made some important implementation decisions on the fly that we're benefiting from still today regarding security and data management. Sangeetha, I'd like to kick it over to you and let me know if you want to share screen and any of the parts of the workflow you want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Zach. And we have been, tasked at Stanford UIT, tasked with integrating ORCID with the Stanford network identifier, which more commonly is called the SUNIT ID. And at the time, it was more of like ORCID wanting to make a decision to allow researchers to link their SUNIT ID to an ORCID and, more of a self-service than someone just plopping an ORCID ID into a SUNIT ID and not having the visibility to what is happening to their, SUNIT ID or ORCID integration when they would want to maybe have multiple ORCIDs and they would want to only associate, a single ORCID to Stanford and maybe other ORCID IDs to other universities. Researchers could, as everyone is probably aware, researchers can have multiple ORCIDs, but
I just want to jump in real quick, Sangeetha. You raised a really great point. So how many ORCID IDs does our system allow?
Only one for one
exactly.
For an institution.
In hindsight, that was a really important choice to make because we were going back and forth about user experience. And it turns out that we're very much in line with federal policy. So the guidance around identity and persistent identifiers for researchers state that there really should be one. So we were a little ahead of the game, and that choice ended up really working out for us. Thanks.
Exactly. And I think that was a real important aspect, even in terms of associating a SUNIT ID to an ORCID, because a researcher can always come back to our portal and to the authorized portal that we have and always change their, whether they want to link or unlink an ORCID and or change the write or read scope of asserting their, what information does the researcher allow ORCID to publish to the research community. So that was an important aspect, and having that as a self-serve does allow them to anytime go to the portal and see what, which ORCID they have associated their SUNET ID with. And I'm just going to quickly share how the portal looks. And maybe, this is kind of like, I'm not a researcher, but I do have an ORCID, which I just link or unlink. And it allows them to kind of change their permission that they give to ORCID to read or write, and also it shows exactly which ORCID they have associated with. And as soon as they try to change anything, here it brings up the institutional login, and it lets you choose which university or which institution you would want to associate your ORCID with. And it brings up the Stanford login, and the portal will, ask, since I changed from a read write to a read, it is asking me to authorize access or deny access. And as soon as I do that, it is taking back to my Stanford authorized portal and showing me that your SUNET ID is now connected with ORCID ID.
So and, I think thank you so much for showing that. And let's kind of walk through a little bit like what had to happen there. So we know that now that the ORCID ID that we have in our Stanford systems, and maybe you can share with us like sort of where that's stored and how. The only value that if there is one that exists has to be the real one, because there's no human intervention, there's no human data entry, it's by API. And as you saw in various stages there, the researcher had to give permission. Everything is researcher controlled and opt-in.
Right. And by doing this, what the researcher has done they have associated the ORCID ID as one of their identifiers in Stanford network. As in, like, this becomes part of their identity in the Stanford directory, and this identifiers are published to downstream systems as, Chowhan SUNET ID is now also has another identifier that is, and the identifiers are also stored as, as a link to ORCID. So if I do click on this will route me to ORCID, and they can go and change, their information in ORCID. At this time, again, I mean, this is still a very baby steps that we have taken, and maybe Zach can talk more. There's a lot of potential of how this information can be used in different systems.
So where in our stack is the actual ORCID number stored?
So it's actually, let me actually bring up the LDAP directory. I'll stop the share, and it is stored as an identifier in the LDAP, and also we publish the identifiers, like we as in the Stanford registry that stores person information in the Stanford realm, shows this into, in a web service call, and also in different attributes that are subscribed by downstream systems.
Can you tell us a little bit how that translates to SAML and the role that SAML plays? Oh, that's great. Yeah, actually, what you had up there was kind of interesting, because it shows like the one identifier among many in a trusted system.
Right. So in SAML, all of the eduPerson attributes, ORCID is also one of the identifiers. that is released as part of the SAML attributes. So if you see here, the eduPerson unique ID is my Stanford ID, and then my eduPerson ORCID ID is my another identifier that is released as part of the SAML attributes.
So this is now in the Stanford registry and available to any Stanford system that can access the Stanford registry.
That can authenticate through single sign-on and gets this attribute as a default value.
And we have about we have over 1,000 faculty that have done this already. So we have a growing corpus to build from, so that now in any downstream system that work is available. And we're shooting for 100%, and we'll get there.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about SAML itself, like its purpose, the security assertion markup language, and its role?
Yeah. So I think SAML, as the industry knows, is like the secure authentication markup language that pretty much everyone in the industry. So when Stanford actually authenticates or allows a system to authenticate through the SUNET ID, there are certain default attributes that are released as part of the single sign-on, and the name and their affiliation and their identifiers come as default attributes, as in hey, Stanford recognizes this person and they are affiliated with Stanford, and they have certain identifiers. And in our system, there can be multiple identifiers, as in a campus card ID also is an identifier, or of course ORCID is one of them, and then we have the SUNET ID, which is like the which is their login ID is one identifier, and then there are backend identifiers kind of like which recognize or help us manage duplicate identities are also part of the identifiers list, which makes sure that there is not the same person who's trying to log in with multiple identifiers. So there's called a registry ID, then there is an univ ID, which are exposed through single sign-on, but not necessarily always used as logins.
So anytime anyone logs into anything at Stanford, these are available to the developer of that system, right?
Correct. Yes.
And I think that might be a good segue to talk to Ian. So I'll let Ian describe his system because he'll do it better than me. But Ian Mathews is the co-founder of Rediviz, which is a system that we use for data management, access, and discovery and analysis here at Stanford, kind of a multifarious tool. And he was one of the first ORCID adopters at Stanford as far as platforms go. And because Sangeetha, and I want to give you some props here in front of everybody. Exposure of that registry attribute at login time was not something that was in scope at the beginning of this project. We hadn't thought ahead about its reuse value. That was something that Sangeetha thought to do. It exceeded the original scope. It was like this bonus, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions we made in the whole project. And because it was available, without us even having to do outreach, there was no press release. Ian noticed, and I'll let him tell you what happened next.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. Thank you, Sangeetha. So yeah, we were just writing a few tests for our authentication workflow when we noticed that Stanford was now releasing an ORCID attribute on the SAML response. So Rediviz allows for researchers to log in through their academic institution credentials via SAML 2.0. We're part of InCommon, which means that this works across thousands of universities around the world. And as Zach mentioned, we've supported ORCID, we've supported researchers tying their ORCID credentials to their Rediviz account for some time now through the OAuth flow. But obviously that's an extra step that every researcher has to take. And so invariably people just don't do it. And it's obnoxious to the researcher if they're providing their ORCID credentials for every single application that ultimately is working within this ecosystem. Whereas if they can do this once through their institution, through Stanford in this scenario, and then that ORCID identifier be passed to Redivіз or to the service provider at login time, it's easier for everyone. So we were really excited when we saw this attribute. We immediately started consuming it and assigning that ORCID ID to the researcher's record if it didn't previously exist. And then once we've consumed the ORCID ID, we really use it for two things on Redivіз. The first is for identity and attestation, kind of what we're talking about here today. Redivіз can be used to host completely public data sets, but also high-risk PHI, HIPAA-protected data sets. And so obviously, it's very important that the data administrator who's granting access really understands who the person is that they're granting access to. So this is just one more identifier in that package. And then I know this isn't kind of the core focus of this kind of talk today, but we also use ORCID for contributor credit and attribution, so that the ORCID ID is present in kind of the metadata payload that ultimately gets cited on a data set, which is ultimately key for researchers getting credit for their work, for the data sets that they contribute to. So very quickly, I can just show you what this looks like in the interface. And of course, Sangeetha and our team have done most of the work and actually giving us the ORCID. It's really just what do we use it for at this point. We're looking here at a data set on Redivіз. This is hosted by the Stanford Center for Population Health Sciences. This is a fairly restricted data set. And what we can see at kind of right at the top is that this data set does have two contributors. These are staff at Stanford PHS. And their ORCID IDs are tied to their accounts, and therefore we are able to imbue the metadata, the data site metadata that gets attached to the DOI for this data set with these ORCID IDs, and make sure that these contributors get credit for their work. But importantly, when a researcher goes to apply for access to this data set, again, this is quite a restricted data set. There are a lot of requirements in order to gain different levels of access. But one of the requirements that's been defined is this ORCID authentication. So it is required that I have linked ORCID to my account in order to work with this data set. This used to be one more step for researchers. They'd have to go in, they'd have to do the OAuth flow on Redivіз, link their ORCID, but because of Sangeetha's work, this is already checked off for a large number of researchers at Stanford. And then when a data administrator goes to approve any access requests for a particular individual, so this is the admin view of my account within this research organization, they can see here alongside some basic information about the individual. We also see that their ORCID ID is tied in here as well. And we can obviously pull that up and see the individual here.
Thanks, Ian. So this is pretty exciting because this is a full end-to-end flow here. And from a user experience perspective, the user didn't actually have to do anything. If they had connected their ORCID to their Stanford ID ahead of time, all they have to do is log into ORCID, and all of these things are happening invisibly in the background. Yeah. And I think what I'd like to assert is that this is in fact an institutional assertion. So not of the type that we typically see in ORCID, where it's written within the ORCID record. And in some ways, this might be as strong or maybe even a stronger assertion because of what Sangeetha was saying in terms of combining with other identifiers in a trusted system of record. So the only way that this ORCID ID can get into our registry is via API. So I'll also call out for the audience that any system that asks you to hand type your ORCID is not something that we should be relying on. So this is API to API connection. It has an audit trail, and the assertion that we're making is alongside others. So this person really works at Stanford, and that comes from HR systems. That can't be, as soon as that person's relationship with Stanford ends, they're not going to be able to do that again. So right next to that is the ORCID ID. So taken together, that is in fact an institutional assertion that we can rely on. And then just taking a sneak peek ahead of like where this could go. Other access controls that Ian has in his system that we use are things like city program training for human subjects research. So you will have had to have passed certain courses within the city training program in order to gain access to that data set, in addition to all the other controls that you saw on the screen that he shared. Well, as it happens, City has also integrated with ORCID. So I'm hoping that in the near future, the training assertions will be available next to the identity assertions, so that we can remove yet another step from the user experience requirements in a way that is trusted, secure, and safe. I think with that, I'm going to hit the stop button. I hope you have a great conference, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.